In today's midweek episode, we're going to take a look at a mini park that Walt once considered developing on land right next to Disneyland. And let me be transparent up front. This idea had a few incarnations, but the first and last version of this concept was pegged around 9 or 10 acres, which is close to the size of those later Mickey Mouse Village parks, and is of course smaller than the park that was considered for Monterey. And so some versions of this concept, I would say, do fall within the larger range for what I would consider a mini park, though other incarnations of it might not. Right now, next to Disneyland in the old parking lot, is a theme park focused on the culture of California. And surprisingly, back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Walt considered building a park there focused on the culture of California, though his ideas for this park are very different than what was actually built there 35 years after his passing. So if you've got all of that down, let's jump in to see how all of this once worked. For the most part, during the late 1950s and early 1960s, Walt thought of mini parks or micro parks as a way to move aspects of the Disneyland experience to other parts of the country and even abroad. As we've already discussed, Walt imagined a string of Mickey Mouse Club parks that might go next to shopping malls and city parks. But there was one time in which Walt explored at least what was initially a second small park next to Disneyland. But there's a little more to set up here, as this project very clearly demonstrates how Walt's ideas of theming changed through the 1950s and into the 1960s. And that is probably the best place for us to start today. When Disneyland opened, its key design strategy was to use the tools of Hollywood set design to make themed areas that looked like the movies. To do this, Walt hired Hollywood art directors, architects, and engineers, and asked them essentially to create real-world themed areas that resembled backlot sets at live-action studios. With this, Disney produced Frontierland after the Western films, Adventureland, which was consciously designed with an eye toward the Tarzan films, Main Street, which was after period dramas, and so on. But then Walt proposed an interesting question. Up until its opening, Disneyland art directors were simply using the tools of set design to create cinematic experiences inside the park. For example, when guests stepped into Frontierland, they could feel as though they were stepping into the world of a John Wayne Western. The initial wave of Disneyland design largely asked Hollywood art directors to create Hollywood sets for Disneyland. Only these sets, of course, would need to be permanent buildings strong enough to welcome millions of guests each year. And Disneyland, I'm pretty sure, would have been successful if it only did just that for the rest of Walt's lifetime, presented new waves of movie-inspired environments and attractions to expand the park every year or two. But after the park opened, Walt wanted to know how else he might use Hollywood set design to create environments that lifted guests up out of the modern urban world and place them into unique environments that would be difficult to visit elsewhere. One of his first ideas was to consider how the tools of set design might allow art directors to create little villages where guests felt they were wandering through European countries. In 1955 and 1956, Walt considered an international area. As we've talked about in other episodes in this series, one of the largest financial barriers for family travel in the late 1950s and early 1960s was the cost of airline tickets during a period when the industry was regulated. In 1960, a typical round-trip ticket from Los Angeles to London was $500, or just over $5,000 in today's dollars. For a family of 4, that would be the equivalent to $20,000, again in today's dollars. So Europe might be enticing for many families, but also financially out of their reach. In 1955, Walt's initial idea was to place the international area behind Main Street. But then in 1956 and 1957, this idea expanded into a whole land, one that would stretch from the castle all the way back to land now used for It's a Small World, a series of international villages, each themed to a different region of the world. Ultimately, this was never built, though the seeds of this idea, along with other influences, likely contributed to the concept of World Showcase at Epcot and then later to sections of Animal Kingdom such as Harambe Village, where the tools of set design recreate distant locations inside of an American-themed project. Next, Walt wondered if the tools of set design might bring guests more deeply into the past, specifically into the world of American history. Again, the big design question here seems to be, how can the tools of immersive cinematic set design be used to bring visitors into a place they couldn't easily visit outside of the park? In this case, a believable recreation of the past. In 1956, 1957, and the years following, Walt considered making a set of smaller lands, or squares as he called them, each themed to a different period of American history. One land focused on the period of the American Revolution, another focused on American cities at the end of the 1800s, and another showcasing New Orleans during the time of the Louisiana Purchase. These ideas were developed off and on for years. One of them would eventually give rise to the Carousel of Progress, which starts at the end of the 1800s. Another, after substantial change, would become New Orleans Square, though its historical presentation of the Louisiana Purchase period was sort of lost as it developed. Yet another, years after Walt's death, would become Liberty Square at the Magic Kingdom in Disney World. And then, in a category beyond this, in addition to new uses for Hollywood-style set design, in the late 1950s, after visiting the Brussels World's Fair, Walt saw another way that Disneyland might expand. It might function as a type of exposition space where the public can observe new or futuristic technologies in action. Disneyland already had small touches of this impulse arranged into its lands, most notably in the House of the Future, a plastic house with automated appliances that showcased how people might live in the near future. Beyond this, in 1959, Walt arranged for a version of the Alweg monorail developed in Germany to be showcased at his park, largely as a means of introducing Americans to a new technology, a monorail that ran smoothly on top of the beam as opposed to hanging monorails that ran beneath it. And he believed that this monorail might solve problems of traffic congestions that many experienced in American cities. It was during this period, as Walt began to see his park as a place that might showcase newly developed inventions and products that could transform American life, that he considered how Disneyland might expand with a new exhibit-style park built on land then used by, in part, the parking lot. In this, the mini park that Walt once imagined for Disneyland would combine these two design impulses to create amusement areas that, through theme, lifted guests up beyond the anxieties of the modern world by placing them into uniquely created environments that were both immersive and believable, and also to develop amusement areas that introduce guests to inventions and products that define the future of American living. At the end of the 1950s, the Disneyland Resort overall had 4 distinct areas. There was Disneyland the Park, which was about 65 or so acres. There was the Disneyland Hotel, owned by the Rather Company, which occupied about 30 acres. There was a corporate rental area called Holidayland, with a baseball field, a playground, horseshoe pits, volleyball courts, and a tented area for catered meals, which was about 9 or so acres. And there was a massive parking lot that occupied roughly 100 acres. At the end of the 1950s, Walt eyed 2 areas for expansion. In the years since opening the Holidayland catering area, which was mostly sold to companies for special events, managers understood that it wasn't as popular as they had initially hoped. Companies did rent the space for private functions, but not nearly as many as Disney had hoped. This here was one possible area for expansion. Disney could put a reasonably sized expansion on the 9 or 10 acres then occupied by the Holidayland catering and events area, which was likely enough for a mini park with a new theme. Beyond this, the resort could also create a second park or a second gated area of sorts by converting a portion of its original parking lot, which is where DCA now stands, into a themed area separate from Disneyland. For years, Disney had explored ways to develop the periphery land around the park with the goal of bringing more locals over to the resort and also to create activities for families looking to spend a longer vacation time at Disneyland. The resort investigated a number of ideas: an arboretum featuring plants from all over the world, a golf course, an ice skating rink, and even an orange grove drive-through area. Orange trees could be equipped with ladders and tourists could pick their own oranges from Disneyland, suggested one proposal. Merchandising could provide a unique Disneyland orange sack. After all, Disneyland still had areas outside the park proper with orange trees, and ladders, of course, would be easy to arrange. Beyond this, 2 complete reports focused on a proposed Disney-owned bowling alley, but interest in that ceased as managers came to understand that bowling alleys made most of their money from leagues to use their facilities and that tourists wouldn't bring enough revenue to replace leagues that would likely be missing from their on-property bowling alley. One of the ideas that bubbled up early in 1959 was to create a second small gated area, a mini park just outside Disneyland, an area that in this early phase of exploration was then called Vacationland. It would be a showcase for outdoor recreation that at this time Walt imagined might only be open during the summer months from June through September. It would include demonstrations of key outdoor activities, from boating to fishing, from golf to hunting, with display areas arranged to resemble various outdoor settings, with even a lake large enough for actual boat demonstrations. As Disneyland manager Jack Sayers explained in April 1959, "At the moment, this is still just a plan. We have to find out how practical it is, what has an entirely different concept of what a show for sportsmen should be." This concept of using Hollywood set design to create natural environments that temporarily allowed visitors to leave problems of the modern urban world behind was already a key design philosophy of Disneyland. For the past 4 years, Disneyland lifted visitors up out of their regular everyday worlds and placed them down into the world of cinema and TV with lands fashioned after films. Now, with this proposed project, Disney would do the same with natural environments. In this new area, WED designers would use the tools of set design to create areas of natural wonders, places that also could visually take visitors away from the world of urban living. Walt visualizes it in a real-life natural setting as though the tourist were on an actual camping trip up in the high Sierras, Sayers continued. We would want the visitor to enter a vacation land that would take him 1,000,000 miles from city life. There would be actual demonstrations of speeding boats, trailers, station wagons, as well as the usual fly fishing. At this point, Sayers believed that it was likely, assuming the underlying financials checked out, that the project would open the following summer. He also believed that it would only be open during the summer months, or about 120 days each year, and that the area would be a permanent addition to the Disneyland resort. But little progress was made on vacation land in 1959, but the idea stayed with Walt. In 1960, Walt asked Ed Ettinger, the PR manager at Disneyland, and others to explore what might be built in this area and if, from an economic standpoint, it would be successful. Though Ettinger didn't know this yet, these ideas for a new park or exhibition area on the Disney property would shape the direction of the Disney company for years to come. The concept that Ettinger developed over years was an expansion of the one that Jack Sayers had explored in 1959. The original idea was to present boat and fishing displays inside of seemingly natural environments that had been art-directed together by Wed. Ettinger expanded this idea into something more specific. These areas just wouldn't be generic outdoor settings. They would be recreations of iconic California natural environments. The park in this plan would be called California Living. Ettinger believed this concept would speak to tourists visiting the Golden State as well as locals who live there. As a tourist attraction, California Living probably outranks even Disneyland for its influence on the decision to make a vacation trip to California. One memo explained. When tourists speak of wanting to see California, their interest goes beyond scenic and natural attractions, the homes, the people, the way they live, how they play their entertainments, their fashions, their recreations. It is the whole fabric of life and living native to the Golden State that is our principal tourist attraction. In this, the concept grew from an outdoor-themed mini park to something slightly larger that focused on a range of California experiences, mostly tied to the outdoors. To refine this idea into a detailed outline, Ettinger decided to visit popular tourist locations in California that spoke to this theme. One of the first stops for Ettinger was the editorial offices of Sunset Magazine in Menlo Park, a magazine devoted to lifestyles of the western states, with an emphasis on California. He visited there on Monday, August 8, 1960, where he talked to employees and also visited their gardens, a local attraction of sorts that featured plants from the West Coast, a word-of-mouth venue that still received, Ettinger estimated, about 30,000 guests each year to view regional plants. The following weekend, Sunday, August 14th, Ettinger visited the Los Angeles Home Show at the Sports Arena. Overall, he saw thousands and thousands of people at the show, which told him that there was a large interest in the subject matter. But he also noticed that, except for a few displays, most of those attending, despite their interest in new inventions and designs for the home, weren't particularly interested in what they saw, with a couple of exceptions. There was one model house, he wrote, inside of the arena called Leisure Lodge, sponsored by the Douglas Fir and Plywood Association, exhibited as a second home for the mountains, desert, and beach. It was very well attended. He also noticed crowds around other exhibits focused on second homes, even mobile or travel homes, suggesting that what attracted the public were exhibits that allowed them to imagine themselves into the future at a time when they could enjoy more leisure and even luxury. One of his key observations from such visits was that Disney by developing themed areas could create more engaging displays and better involve people with shows, perhaps even some rides. In a September 1960 memo, he noted that an element of show would be an integral part of each exhibit or sponsorship in California living, thereby elevating the Disney area above those industry events he'd so far observed around town. For example, he thought California living might feature skin diving or advanced snorkeling, demonstrations that might be arranged in one of the water areas. This demonstration could be coupled with a Disneyland-style attraction. For example, he wrote, in the California recreation area, a Circarama film, or what we would now call a Circle Vision film, might contain a segment covering skin diving activities with appropriate commercials or plugs for the type of equipment used. The film could, for example, present underwater environments in a circular theater, with a family of divers viewing fish, coral, and anemones. For other exhibit areas, Ettinger believed the expo will utilize audio animatronics and live presentations. In this, he saw that the technology of Disneyland, such as film, themed areas, shows, and animatronics, might transform a range of design, leisure, and living shows that in the early 1960s were popular around the country. At this time, he imagined a combination theme park and design expo, something that would encompass a large portion of Disneyland's parking lot and likely Holidayland, as Holidayland was underperforming in terms of corporate rentals. He pictured a Disney-developed expo that presented a range of up-to-date or near-future primary year-round homes, from Spanish California style to a rambling ranch-style home to Hawaiian modern. Then he pictured other themed areas that would present second homes and vacation activities, such as a mountain chalet in the Sierras, a desert retreat in Palm Springs, or a beach home in Malibu. He believed that these exhibits would be so popular that Disney should consider a double exposure arrangement, which offered guests 2 paths to see the rooms inside of each model home. Restaurants would be integrated into each area's theme, with extensive use of dioramas, dramatic lighting, and setting to provide show. He imagined at least 5 restaurants, all named after a California region, from Santa Barbara, with a focus on Spanish missions and early California history, to Beverly Hills, with background dioramas of the Hollywood Strip at night, to Monterey, themed to the fishing wharf with a diorama overlooking the water. He also believed this new expo, even though next to Disneyland, would have a strong identity with adults. As such, these restaurants could serve cocktails, beer, and wine. Beyond this, he believed one central attraction would be a Circle Vision tour of the state, from skiing at Squaw Valley to deep-sea fishing at Catalina to camping in Yosemite and clam digging at Pismo Beach. Animatronics such as the animals in Nature's Wonderland might be used to create a heightened realism in some of the mountain and desert areas, and craft demonstrations would be assembled as shows pitched toward education and entertainment. A central auditorium building would be large enough to also be used as a convention center to present both traveling acts and home and garden shows during Disneyland's off-season. In this, Ed Ettinger's revision of Jack Sayre's proposal became part World's Fair layered with concepts from most every successful home flower and garden and craft and food festival that moved each year through Southern California. In late September 1960, Walt asked Buzz Price, an economist associated with Disney for the past 7 years, to assemble a land use report to present a more detailed study of the feasibility of the California Living Project, with the goal of determining the income potential from visitors, income potential from lessees and industry exhibitors, project requirements, and overall economic possibilities of a new gated area focused on design and lifestyle elements associated with California. For most reports, Price worked with one or two fellow economists that he employed. The materials assembled during these weeks first examined other likely businesses that might be built on the land. They ruled out camping, too low of a financial return. Lodging, the Anaheim market was already saturated with hotels, sports fields, outside of the Disney image, and a large arena. Local population was insufficient to support it. Disney was open to retail stores, but only as part of a larger theme development. Disney was also open to restaurants, especially as Disney executives believed that many locals and Disneyland tourists were driving over to Knott's Berry Farm to enjoy their famous chicken dinners. One internal document went so far as to estimate that Disney was losing $1.53 million in restaurant sales each year to Knott's, tourist dollars that, with a little planning, might eventually land in a Disney-owned cash register. Then Buzz Price's team looked to Edinger's concept on California living. In terms of practical design at this point, the Disney team intended to lease out restaurant space to famous California restaurateurs. Retail and show space as well would be leased out to companies that specialized in products geared toward California lifestyles, home design elements, and outdoor activities. With this, California living wouldn't be an amusement park per se. It would be a multi-themed outdoor plaza that would incorporate elements of a public garden and a high-end home show with some amusement park elements. It would, of course, be a smaller park than Disneyland. In 1960, the total accumulated cost to build and improve Disneyland over the previous 6 years hovered around $30 million. Estimates to build California living were around $7 million. Likewise, in 1960, Disneyland received roughly 5 million guests and estimated that this number would grow to roughly 6 million by 1964. In contrast, Buzz Price estimated that California living would receive roughly 1.5 million guests each year, with adults paying an estimated $1.50 admission fee. The lower attendance, though, was offset by the lower cost to develop it. Beyond this, Disney would also receive money from lessees that used the grounds to exhibit their own products. With these elements, the results were favorable enough to allow the project to move forward in development. At the end of 1960, Disney was advised to better develop the themed areas with a full site plan and detailed layouts for the model homes, diorama areas, and restaurants, so construction costs could be better estimated. With this, Ed Edinger was given a green light to continue concept development. Once the holiday season was over, Ed Edinger again spent part of his time each week researching possibilities for California living. On Saturday, February 4th, 1961, he visited the National Sports and Boat Show in San Francisco, where he noted that exhibits which have some mechanical movement or guest participation definitely tend to keep the patron longer. On Sunday, February 12th, he attended the Mobile Home and Gravel Trailer Show at the Great Western Exhibition Center, where he noted that one exhibitor with a play area for children received more business than almost everyone else. On Sunday, February 19th, 1961, he visited the Pottery Shack in Laguna Beach, an open-air bazaar where some locals demonstrated the craft of pottery. Edinger observed hundreds pass through the shack each hour. In terms of exhibition at Disneyland, he noted, there appeared to be very good possibilities for interesting shows developed around the fashioning, glazing, painting, and baking of various pottery types of products for sale. At the Shack, artisans simply worked in public areas viewable to guests, but Ettinger felt with better arrangement, these elements might become more of a formal show with specific demonstration times and a professional host. Even before visiting the Shack, Ettinger had worked up a list of crafts that might be demonstrated in California living, with most of the products designed for home or personal use. Among them were woodworking, glassblowing, leather crafts, visual artists, and basket making. On Monday, February 27th, Ettinger visited the World of Flowers and Garden Show at the Pan Pacific Auditorium, a 10-day event with a $1.50 admission charge. The show, with themed garden areas, he felt drew more enthusiasm from visitors than earlier shows he had visited. He also noted that this show smartly worked with garden clubs in the area to increase attendance. After this, at least according to the paper trail, plans appear to have stalled out for a while in spring and then during the peak season of summer. But once summer crowds departed from Anaheim, another Disneyland manager, again Jack Sayers, joined the team to develop a conceptual framework for a new park or exhibition grounds. By this time, Summit Disneyland felt a more general theme might be more appealing than the one tied to California, especially for tourists visiting from out of state, such as the theme Designed for Living, though the major concepts for the park remained mostly the same. In October, Sayers, a manager who oversaw lease space and industrial sales at Disneyland, was given permission to further develop Ettinger's recent ideas. Also, a budget for 2 artists to create conceptual artwork that would visually rough out the proposed development. The 2 artists both had worked with Disneyland for a while. The first was Roy Williams, a story artist who had worked at Disney for decades and was famous for being the big musketeer on the Mickey Mouse Club. And the other was Jack Olson, originally a background artist who now worked with the park as well. By this point, the concept had expanded far beyond the realm of a mini park. The plans, which continued to evolve over many months, produced a detailed design proposal for a new park and exhibition area that would fold in many show ideas that Ettinger, and before that Jack Sayers, had explored over the previous 2 years. Though individual concepts changed from month to month, the general idea remained the same. The park would be centered around a hub, radiating out into at least 3 themed areas presenting the various landscapes of California. First, the mountain area. Second, the beach and marina area. And third, the desert area, with the hub itself holding a show arena, medium-sized auditorium with 1,000 to 1,500 seats, or convention building for shows such as the Ice Capades or aquatic-type shows, horse shows, dog shows, and so on. The entrance to each themed area would be lined with shops. For example, when entering the mountain resort area, the shops would include clothing stores such as Pendleton, along with others focused on hiking, fishing, skiing, and camping equipment. The themed areas would present acres of land fashioned to a unique environment in California. The mountain area would contain a man-made mountain range, a small-gauge railroad, lakeside homes and cabins, as well as restaurants, including one built like a hunting lodge that would feature wild game on the menu. On one side of a man-made lake, there would be boating and water ski demonstrations. For the beach area on the other side of that same man-made lake, there would be a coastal marina with fishing and seafood restaurants. The desert would have a golf and tennis area with the possibility of hosting national tournaments, also a barbecue restaurant. By now, the committee exploring this idea had expanded to 10 people. And those 10 people were some of the most powerful within the Disney organization, including Walt and Roy, Card Walker, Don Tatum, Dick Irvine, and Joe Fowler. Also, by this point, Disneyland managers understood its market. There were 2 components: tourists who visited Disneyland once, perhaps never to return, and Southern California locals who, in the words of Stan Jones, must be given features in or near Disneyland that will continue to draw them back to Anaheim time and time again. The central auditorium space at California Living could be configured with touring shows or trade shows to encourage repeat visitation from locals. At this point again, the paper trail for this new park falls off, though it's likely that at this point the trail grows cold because, just as Buzz Price suggested, a more precise set of concepts be used to estimate construction costs, likely with an outside contractor. Such an effort would not only explain the gap here in the paperwork, but if those estimates were on the high side, they would explain what followed. In subsequent months, the idea for a large gated exposition space went away, as the concept shrunk again down toward a modest development. The following year, Ed Ettinger talked with Walt Disney at the end of September about creating a smaller version of California Living in the 9 acres once used for corporate picnics, as managers by this point had decided to close the underperforming Holiday Land. For this smaller space, Ettinger narrowed down the scope of the exposition to focus on vacation lifestyles arranged into a single season to test its popularity. The concept, now closer again to a mini park, returned to its original name, Vacation Land, as the deeply themed California environments were removed from the project. For a few days, Ettinger worked on an outline, then sent a formal proposal over to Walt. In an inter-office communication from Ettinger to Walt Disney, he said, "In line with our conversation last week, as regards to the use of Holiday Land during the summer of 1963, here is an outline which might serve as a starting point. The Holiday Land area would be developed as a short-term exhibition area themed to vacation living. The total area might be named Vacation Land, so that next summer show could be billed as Vacation Living 1963 in Vacation Land." This new version of a lifestyle exposition was more focused on exposition areas presenting possibilities for family outings, with various themed areas as well as a central stage for cooking demonstrations and special presentations. The proposal was apparently well received because a week later, Ettinger sent in a longer and more detailed proposal outlining exactly how those acres might be turned into an exhibition space. A Vacation Living, he wrote, would be based on the exhibition and display of new designs, products, innovations, which contribute to the pleasures, comfort, or enjoyment of family vacation living. It would function as a research laboratory where we could test audience appeal and interest of specific exhibits and displays for later evaluation of long-range potentials. This smaller version of a lifestyle exhibition would have no entry charge for guests, with income derived from exhibitors. An early outline presented an exhibit area that included 3 or 4 more walkthrough models of vacation or second homes, and 6 or more canvas-covered pavilions themed to different types of mobile housing and living on land and afloat. Areas would be themed to a mountain setting, a beach or lakefront setting, and a desert setting, each with a walkthrough model home. There would be additional areas for trailers and RVs, a temporary lake to present boats and watercraft, along with equipment for exploring the world off-road in the backcountry. But then the idea of Vacation Land started to fade away, though the underlying concept didn't entirely disappear. 2 months after Ettinger made his detailed pitch for the smaller version of Vacation Land, Walt became interested in a California-themed amusement, museum, and exposition area in Monterey, proposed for the Del Monte properties, which transferred some of Walt's interest in a California theme project to a new location. But eventually, like many other mini or partial day parks imagined by Walt in the early 1960s, California Living or Vacation Land, too, was eventually pushed aside as Walt became more involved in other, often larger projects. In 1963, he was more focused on the World's Fair, and once that was over, he was focused on building a new resort in Florida, and with that, California Living, along with that other California-themed project in Monterey, fell away into the deep files of Disneyland history. Even though California Living was never built, its plans are essential in connecting Walt's park in California to his later interest in Florida. One of the mysteries in Walt's life concerns Epcot, his plans to design a city that would have served as a model of near-future living, from houses to apartments to work areas and shopping districts. Most documentaries and biographies on Walt present Epcot as a direct outgrowth of his work on Disneyland. But there are many, mostly invisible steps that Walt explored in the early 1960s that moved him toward a model city that he once wanted to build. California Living is one of those steps, a series of model homes arranged so visitors might see new possibilities for their own homes, for how their living space might play out in a slightly different, better organized, better designed world. This by itself is certainly not yet Epcot the city, but it's one of the steps that begins to connect up Walt's familiarity with themed amusements and expositions with his growing interest in city planning. Another important connection here is the exploration of recreational lifestyles, nearly all of which would play into the development of Walt Disney World in Florida. In many ways, Disneyland, when it opened, in terms of operations, was a fairly straightforward outdoor amusement area. Walkways, stores, restaurants, landscape features, shows, and attractions. Disney World, of course, would have a feature that also functioned as a traditional outdoor amusements area, which is the Magic Kingdom. But it also developed other areas that used an entirely different business model, specifically those arranged around recreation. Boating and fishing was planned for Disney World. Skin diving was also considered for the Florida resort before designers in California understood the actual dangers of alligators and snakes. One early plan was to sink structures in Seven Seas Lagoon near the Poly that guests could observe with a rented mask and fins. In fact, next time you're at the Great Ceremonial House at the Poly, look for some artwork up on the wall, there on the ground floor, created in the late 1960s, that presents this concept of skin diving down in Seven Seas Lagoon. In other words, some of the plans and research that went into the unbuilt California Living project would pay off in robust and mature concepts considered early on for the development in Florida. But these ideas of recreation, which are fully realized in Florida, begin to move into the Disney theme park milieu here with California Living. Moving down the timeline a little bit more, other elements of Ettinger's plans for California Living are similar to those that are much later developed for Epcot, the theme park, not the city, in the mid-1990s, such as the Flower and Garden and the Food and Wine festivals. When these festivals first premiered, a number of longtime operations managers who knew Ettinger in California oversaw many areas of Florida, though I couldn't tell you if Ettinger's plan in any way influenced later plans to create similar type of expo festivals at Epcot. Clearly, some of that early dialogue about how a theme park might work in terms of various gardening, wine, culinary, and lifestyle elements first entered the Disney discussion about parks at this point in the early 1960s. Beyond this, and perhaps most surprising, though California Living eventually fell into the lost wonderlands of history, Nearly 4 decades later, long after most, though not quite everyone involved with the original California Living project had either retired or passed away, in the late 1990s, the Walt Disney Company, under the direction of Michael Eisner, developed Disney's California Adventure, or DCA, pretty much on the exact same land Walt once considered for California Living. A new team of designers laid out a park that contained many of the same area concepts originally considered for various versions of California Living. A land that celebrated Hollywood, with notes of that Beverly Hills restaurant that looked out onto a recreation of the Sunset Strip. A Monterey Wharf area, similar to the one in Editor's plans, and other lands designed to present the landscapes of the desert and the mountains, with restaurants emphasizing California cuisine and wine, and areas demonstrating California cooking, such as sourdough bread and tortillas. There was even a theater-based attraction that showed various landscapes of the Golden State, with some of the locations in the film identical to those imagined by Ettinger for the Circle Vision film he proposed for California Living. But here's the interesting thing. I would lay money that Eisner's team, or at least most of them, never knew of Walt's plan to build California Living, as it was never mentioned in any of the press releases nor in internal publications. Also, the Eisner team never pointed to Walt's plans for California Living when the press repeatedly beat up the Disney company for wandering too far from Walt's vision with DCA. The basic undercurrent of most criticism of DCA when it opened was that it wasn't simply Disney enough. The California Living concept, designed during Walt's lifetime, would have been the perfect rejoinder to undercut those early critics of DCA. I'm guessing that the similarities between California Living and DCA, or at least most of them, are simply an elaborate coincidence, a path independently explored by two groups of Disney designers, one in the early 1960s and the other in the 1990s, with ideas echoing down the corridors of time. But then again, this is only an educated guess. There's always the possibility that at least some portion of DCA can be stitched back to designs that originated during Walt's time. Let me close up our episode now with one last thing. 3 episodes ago, I started with the observation that the major biographies on Walt were largely focused on film, more so than on the parks and real estate projects, because the authors of those biographies were more interested in film. They were essentially either film historians or film journalists. But there's an additional element beyond that as to why the biographies privilege film over the parks, which I think is apparent by this point in our story today. Walt's animated features and live-action projects were produced under Walt Disney Productions, a company with a large support staff who kept excellent records. For example, there are line-by-line notes of what each participant said at many meetings that concerned the development of animated classics. That is, in terms of writing a biography, the studio kept a wealth of information, reasonably well organized, that depicted how all of the major classics were created. Walt's work with theme parks was organized under a private company he wholly owned called WED. It would remain independent, owned by Walt until 1965. Likewise, Disneyland was also its own company, then called Disneyland Incorporated, which was separate from Walt Disney Productions until 1960. But even after Walt Disney Productions bought out the major shareholders of Disneyland, most notably the ABC network, the park already had a tradition of operating as its own company or as its own unit that was somewhat separate from Walt Disney Productions. And neither WED nor Disneyland Incorporated had the breadth of support staff nor the funding to type up and store moment-by-moment notes of most meetings. And beyond this, there's still one other component that makes these individual park elements a little more difficult to track down and present as a unified narrative. Walt often liked to isolate groups of managers so that each group had its own assignments, its own projects. WED worked on the design of attractions. Operations managers explored ways to make the park more efficient and profitable. Animators from the studio at times, with their payroll shifted over to WED, explored ways to integrate animated characters more deeply into the park, and so on. But during the early 1960s, for a brief while, Walt needed to rely on the expertise of top Disneyland managers to understand if proposed projects might be both workable and profitable. In this, he repeatedly looped in Jack Sayers. We've talked about him a fair bit in this series so far. Sayers was perfect for this role, in that he understood the entertainment industry, the world of outdoor amusements, and also had an understanding of American tastes. He had started decades earlier as a publicity manager for CBS Radio in 1937, the same year that Snow White was released. Then he worked for George Gallup, whose company measured American tastes and opinions for, among others, film companies. Then he became Disneyland's first Director of Customer Relations in 1955, that is the year the park opened. In October 1963, Jack Sayers made a list of the real estate projects beyond California Living that he knew Walt was considering or had recently considered. I'll break this list into a few categories. First, the large theme parks. In this category are parks outside of California, parks that, if they moved forward, would be handled more by Buzz Price and designers at WED. In this category are the multi-story indoor park for St. Louis, a possible park for Florida, and a possible park for Liberty Park, New Jersey. Liberty Park was just one of the locations that Walt considered in the Northeast before deciding that winters there with the park closed was too large of a downside for a Disney project on the East Coast. The second category is outdoor recreation projects. In this category is a resort that Walt briefly considered developing on Catalina Island, likely in conjunction with the Irvine Ranch Company. Also on this list is a project connected to both the Rio Grande Railroad and possibly a mountain resort in Silverton, Colorado. This was an early version of the Disney Ski Resort, a concept that eventually evolved over time into the proposed Disney Ski Resort at Mineral King in California. These types of projects were mostly overseen by Bill Cottrell and economist Bob Hicks, a business manager who became more focused on Walt's interest in areas of natural beauty. The third category, smaller regional projects that mostly incorporate Disneyland-style amusements and rides into parks not focused on film. In this category are the Monterey Project and also a small project for Niagara Falls, where Walt was considering opening a Circle Vision Theater and also possibly one other ride. As these were traditional amusement projects, these were mostly overseen by people from Disneyland such as Sayers and Ed Edinger. Lastly, there's a category that I'll call city redevelopment. In this category, I'll put just one entry from Sayers' list, but it's important. Walt agreed to assist his friend Joyce Hall, founder of Hallmark, in redeveloping a rundown area in Kansas City around the Hallmark headquarters. This would nudge Walt a little more toward city planning and toward Epcot. In this, he looked to WED art director and project manager John Hench. But as you can see, there are a lot of projects under consideration or even under active development in 1963, mostly farmed out to different teams within the larger Disney umbrella. For a while, Jack Sayers saw little pieces of this puzzle swirl around him. As with executive experience at Disneyland, he was asked to comment on most real estate projects. But as 1963 moved into 1964 and then 1965, each of these categories became its own unofficial subsection inside of the larger Disney effort, with not a lot of talk between those groups. And this is one of the reasons why that instead of having one large story about how all of these projects moved through Walt's life, there are now a lot of smaller stories, each with its own cast of individuals, each with its own working group trying to push forward the project. These projects are all steps along the company's path towards bigger ideas, but in ways isolated steps that mostly have been left out of the major biographies. Only with Disney World in Florida would the entire company again come together as a unified entity to focus its attention and resources together on a single project. 1959 through 1963 would remain the high point of Walt's interest in these mini, micro, or regional parks. But beyond these, there's a couple more to talk about, one of which begins at the end of Walt's life and the other happens years after his passing. And we'll get to both of those before we finish up our story here, or perhaps stories about mini parks that were designed by Disney, but then never built. I'll be back on Sunday with a new episode. In that episode, among other things, we'll take a look at a mini park idea from the end of Walt's lifetime and the years that immediately followed, that was completely designed around just one Disney movie. Also, if you're over on our Bandcamp site, you can find 2 other series related to the material that we've been talking about here. As I discussed today, there's just not one narrative that easily connects up Walt's interest in a range of small parks, mid-sized parks, and large parks that he explored developing in the late 1950s and early 1960s, largely because different groups of people worked on the different projects. But you can find the multi-part story of Riverfront Square, which is the project that came closest to being built in the Bandcamp album called Walt Disney and Riverfront Square. You can also find the multi-part story of the first park Walt wanted to build in Florida, a project entirely separate from Walt Disney World, in a different Bandcamp album called Television, Technology, and a Park in Palm Beach. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney Studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney Company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.